जय जयवंती बीत जय है बीत जय जन्म काज रे बीत जय बीत जय जन्म काज रे जन्म काज जन्म काज रे जन्म बीत जय
I hope I'm welcoming back a lot of you from the lunch break. I'm particularly lucky to have not just the last wonderful panel, the third of the day, but also this panel as well as a facilitator. And I get to share it with a couple of grad students who I've been, absolutely privileged to, to join in classes, to learn from, not just from our professors, but to learn from, my fellow grad students as well. So that's been an absolute pleasure and privilege of mine. So unless, unless you have a different order, I'm going to introduce Tejpaul first because he has seniority, and then Gurbeer second. So today, the first speaker, Tejpaul Singh Bainiwal, is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Riverside. He holds an MA in religious studies. His research focus is on Sikh American history throughout the 20th century. Tejpaul has been working with educators across California to ensure the inclusion of Sikhs and Sikhism within school curriculums. He also serves on the board of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in historic preservation to ensure the proper preservation of Sikh American history. Currently, he is working on the Sikh American History Project, which focuses on oral histories, historic preservation, and archival research to preserve and highlight the history of Sikhs in America. And today, Tejpaul's talk is Social Justice, the Legacy of Guru Tegh Bahadur. I can tell you I've learned a lot through Tejpaul about Sikhs in America. So I'm very excited to see now his presentation, and I'll turn it over to you, Tejpaul. The virtual podium is yours.
Thank you, Adam. And, I just want to start off by saying that it's been a pleasure, and, I really enjoyed all the presentations today. And today I'll be discussing the social justice legacy of Guru Tegh Bahadur. And actually, the last panel was very interesting because some of my presentation actually overlapped with T. Sher Singh as he was talking about loving thy neighbor and the work that the citizen warriors have been doing in Punjab, in India. So I actually over lunch cut a few slides, and instead I'll just focus specifically on the social justice legacy of Guru Tegh Bahadur amongst Sikh Americans. The freedom of religion is a basic human right. As Voltaire once said, I may disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it. Voltaire was expressing his belief in the importance of freedom of religion and freedom of speech. But before Voltaire, however, this ideology was highlighted by the Sikh gurus as they applied their teachings to their lives. During the height of the Mughal Empire, Sikh gurus and leaders stood against injustice and oppression, which at times led to their persecution. In the 17th century, the increasing strength and influence of Guru Tegh Bahadur and the Sikh community threatened the Mughal authorities. The Guru urged his followers to be fearless, stating, "He who holds none in fear, nor is afraid of anyone, is acknowledged as a man of true wisdom." And in pursuit of a just society, Guru Tegh Bahadur challenged Aurangzeb, who was imposing his tyranny upon the residents of his empire. In 1675, a group of Hindu Pandits, scholars from Kashmir, as we heard earlier, visited Anandpur seeking the Guru's help against Aurangzeb's oppressive measures and threats of forced conversion to Islam. The Guru sent a message to Aurangzeb saying that Hindus will convert if and only if Guru Tegh Bahadur could be persuaded to accept Islam. Upon sending this message, the group of Hindu Pandits traveled back to Kashmir as the Guru and a group of dedicated Sikhs marched to Delhi. In an attempt to convert the Guru, the government tortured and executed three of the Guru's closest confidants. One by one, Matidas, Satidas, and Dayaldas were tortured as the Guru was deliberately forced to witness the acts. And then on November 11, 1675, Guru Tegh Bahadur was publicly executed after refusing to abandon his faith. His Shahidi was described in the Granth, and I quote, "It was for the protection of the sacred thread and frontal marks of Hindus that Guru Tegh Bahadur performed a tremendous deed in the Dark Age." For the cause of, he gave his head for the sake of holy men and uttered not a sigh of regret. For the cause of righteousness, he undertook this task, giving his head, yet retaining his honor and resolve to defend the freedom of faith. Each execution from Matidas, Satidas, Dayaldas to Guru Tegh Bahadur was a pivotal moment in Sikh history, as they only further solidified Guru Tegh Bahadur's commitment to stand against injustice and oppression. His fight for Hindus' right to wear their sacred threads and frontal marks was a larger fight for one's right to practice their faith fearlessly and fiercely. Pashora Singh states that if the martyrdom of Guru Arjan helped bring the Sikh Panth together, this second martyrdom helped make human rights and freedom of conscience central to its identity. Guru Tegh Bahadur's march to Delhi was a march against oppression, a march against an unjust government, and a march towards liberation. This was his true legacy. Guru Tegh Bahadur's son, Guru Gobind Singh, carried on this legacy as he began to protect sacred threads and frontal marks at the age of 9. Wilfred Cantwell Smith writes, "The attempt forcibly to convert the 9th Guru to an externalized, impersonal Islam clearly made an indelible impression on the martyr's 9-year-old son, Gobind, who reacted slowly but deliberately by eventually organizing the Sikh group into a distinct, formal, symbol-patterned, boundaried community. During the public execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur, tradition holds that Sikhs in attendance concealed their identity in fear that they would suffer a similar fate. Through the formation of the Khalsa, Guru Gobind Singh bestowed a visible and distinct image upon his followers. Guru Tegh Bahadur's spirit of resistance was embodied externally by the Khalsa, and if we keep this in mind, one can even argue that each and every action of the Khalsa since then, therefore, is a byproduct of Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shahidi. Guru Tegh Bahadur's legacy as a protector of the oppressed was embodied by the Khalsa and continues to be by Sikhs in the diaspora to this day, as well as those in India. But as I mentioned earlier, T. Sher Singh gave a wonderful presentation on that, so I'll just be focusing on the diaspora today. So Ashton Crawley explains that marginal characters are necessary for an understanding of what it means to be human in a place and time. Therefore, in order to completely understand the significance of Guru Tegh Bahadur's legacy, it is crucial to study the actions that Sikhs have taken in response to oppression against marginalized communities, even if they themselves are the marginalized community. So beginning in the late 1890s, Sikhs began to migrate to the US. It did not take long for these early Sikh immigrants to face discrimination as they began immigrating at the height of anti-Asian discrimination and the Yellow Peril. However, Sikhs remained resilient and adamant to continue their pursuit of justice. In 1910, an illustration released by the SF Call captioned a new problem for Uncle Sam, as seen on the right. And an illustration from the Literary Digest from 1923 captioned the problem. Both depicted a turbaned individual to be seen as an issue for America. These illustrations depicting the visible external features of resistance of the Khalsa portrayed by the media was a response to and also led to attacks against Sikh labor workers throughout the West Coast, with the first major attack against Sikhs taking place in 1907 when Sikhs were driven out of Bellingham, Washington. Shortly after this incident in Bellingham, white workmen attacked bunkhouses in the Bay Area of California, and as well as Live Oak near Yuba City. The discrimination, however, and attacks were not only directed towards labor workers, but Sikh students as well. As seen in the left-hand side, in 1921, 3 Sikh graduate students from UC Berkeley were victims of a hazing attacks which targeted their turbans. A group of students captured and lined up the 3 and wanted to unwind their turbans to solve the mystery of what might be underneath. Racism and exclusion were common, and both federal and state legislatures often worked in sync, drawing similarities to the treatment of marginalized communities under Aurangzeb's Mughal rule as well. The discrimination that South Asians faced throughout the state, including the fact that South Asians visiting Stockton or other locations are permitted in only a few of the lodging houses. This seemed to have been a motivating factor for Sikhs to have purchased a building in South Stockton to build Stockton Gurdwara. Despite being oppressed themselves, Sikhs continued to fight the dominant community in pursuit of a just society. Similar to how Guru Tegh Bahadur challenged Emperor Aurangzeb in pursuit of a just society, Sikhs in the US established Stockton Gurdwara, challenging the government's Alien Land Law Act, banning Asian property ownership. And it was Stockton Gurdwara and the Sikhs there which followed Guru Tegh Bahadur's message of fearlessness and justice by serving as not only a place of worship, but also as a meeting place, political forum, and sanctuary for new immigrants and subsequent generations of South Asian immigrants. One example, in 1913, Sikhs in America established the Ghadar movement to free South Asia from colonial rule, with Stockton Gurdwara playing a major role. Then in 1914, Stockton Gurdwara sent a delegation to the nation's capital, to Washington, D.C., to protest a bill looking to exclude South Asians from immigrating to the US. Furthermore, following the establishment of Stockton Gurdwara, the Sikh community wanted to ensure that South Asians would not become charges on public charity. The leadership stated that if a man is hungry and out of funds, we feed him. The unfortunate hungry American will be as welcome as our own people. This was especially highlighted during the years of the Great Depression, when Stockton Gurdwara's policy of providing a meal to anyone was extended to men traveling by boxcar along the tracks adjacent to the temple property. Where the government failed its people, Sikhs rose to the occasion. Now coming to the contemporary period, understanding Guru Tegh Bahadur's legacy of standing against injustice and oppression in a post-9/11 America. September 11th, 2001 impacted the lives of millions of Americans, and among the affected population, thousands of Sikhs were targeted as xenophobia turned into Islamophobia, with images of Al-Qaeda terrorists being plastered over mass media wearing turbans. The visible image of Sikhs brought forth by the byproduct of Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shahidi made life of turbaned individuals in post-9/11 America extremely difficult. Furthermore, blockbuster movies coming out of Hollywood constantly displayed terrorists wearing turbans, which has further ingrained fear and hate for the turban in the minds of Americans. According to a study conducted by Stanford University and SALDEF, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, a majority of individuals that adorn a turban in America are Sikhs, not Muslims. And Gurbeer Singh Sodhi, a Sikh American gas station owner, was the first victim of a hate crime related to the backlash after the 9/11 terrorist attack, when he was gunned down on September 15th, 2001. Many more Sikhs fell victim to the hate crimes in the following years, mostly due to two things: the color of their skin and their turbans and their faith. The most horrific hate crime took place on August 5th, 2012 in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, when a white supremacist opened fire inside a Gurdwara. Despite the persecution of Sikhs, the revolutionary spirit within did not diminish. While the heightened persecution derived from Islamophobia, Sikhs carried on the legacy of being protectors of the oppressed. For starters, rather than remaining silent or pointing fingers at Muslims, it is not an option for Sikhs to throw another community under the bus, even if it means things are harder for Sikhs, unquote. The Shahidis of Matidas, Satidas, Dayaldas, and Guru Tegh Bahadur serves as a constant reminder to Sikhs to stand up for what is right. Within the US, many Sikhs continue to follow the footsteps of Guru Tegh Bahadur. Sikh activism spiked in the US following the September 11th terrorist attacks, and organizations such as SALDEF, United Sikhs, and the Sikh Coalition were empowered to bring about change. Immediately after the 9/11 attacks, SALDEF was the only Sikh American organization to meet with the Secretary of Transportation. It was founded in 1996. SALDEF works to provide equal opportunities for and empower Sikh Americans by protecting civil rights, building dialogue, promoting civic and political participation, and upholding ideologies of social justice and religious freedom for all Americans. Second, United Sikhs was established in 1999 when a group of Sikhs from the New York metropolitan area banded together to assist in the socioeconomic development of immigrant communities in New York. They too focus on and are aiming at empowering those in need, especially disadvantaged and minoritized groups across the world. The third group I wanted to focus on is the Sikh Coalition, which was founded by volunteers on the night of September 11th in response to a torrent of violent attacks against Sikh Americans. While working to protect the constitutional right to practice one's faith without fear, it has become the largest advocacy and community development organization for Sikhs in the US. At the individual level, many Sikhs such as Valerie Kaur and Simanjit Singh also campaigned to bring about political and social change. Both have become prominent voices against injustice as they continue to fight for human and civil rights for all. Guru Tegh Bahadur's social justice legacy has even proven to play a role in Sikh support of the Black Lives Matter movement as seen around the world during the summer of 2020. Following the basic ethos of the Sikh faith, which was highlighted by Guru Tegh Bahadur to stand up against injustice and fight for human rights and freedom of conscience, Sikhs actively participated in marches across the nation in different ways, including but not limited to marching alongside other protesters, serving meals and drinks, and speaking about the importance of the fight against injustice at rallies. Several stories to highlight on how Sikhs have participated in rallies and the movement include in Queens, New York, members of the World Sikh Parliament and the Sikh community served thousands of meals to Black Lives Matter protesters. In the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., not only marching alongside and serving food during the protest, Dr. Rajdeep Singh, a resident at George Washington University, found his background to be useful. At one of the rallies he attended, the police started to pepper spray people, resulting in mass chaos. While protesters began to panic and run, Dr. Singh not only asked people to calmly walk as to protect others from getting injured or trampled on, but also assisted individuals who were struggling with the pepper spray in their eyes. In Los Angeles, the Sikh community in Southern California also provided meals and marched alongside the protesters. Furthermore, advocate Sarvjit Singh addressed the protesters in LA and called for solidarity when stating that if we do not see God in all, we do not see God at all. And then similarly, there is in the Sikh community in Stockton, attended multiple rallies in Stockton and also spoke at these rallies, speaking about the common struggle against white supremacy and the importance of fighting for justice. From the site of the first Gurdwara in Stockton, California, to the nation's capital, Sikhs marched alongside Black Americans as they rallied for justice. And Solidarity also in 2020, Solidarity released their 2020 National Sikh American Survey, which reported that freedom of religion and racial justice were among the most important issues for Sikh Americans. The call to action for Sikhs was not only derived and driven by the teachings from Gurbani, but also from their history, from Satidas, Matidas, Dayaldas, and Guru Tegh Bahadur's sacrifice. The importance of standing up against tyranny is built into the very core of Sikhi, and for generations to come, the fight will continue. From Guru Tegh Bahadur to Valerie Kaur, or even if we're focusing on what T-Share Singh mentioned, and those Sikhs and the citizen warriors in Delhi, each generation has fought valiantly against many different types of oppression in various ways. Individuals have organized to form Sikh civil rights organizations to bring about political and social change at the highest level. Activism is embedded into the very core of Sikhi, and being an activist is synonymous with being a Sikh. And I know Dr. Prashar Singh recently published a paper, and he mentions this in his paper, so I wasn't sure if he was going to be mentioning it in his talk, so I'll just give a very brief note. But in August 1998, Singh mentions that during an 8-day research retreat in BC, Canada, on the topic of the spiritual roots of restorative justice, Prashar Singh made a presentation on Sikhism and restorative justice, theory and practice. During this presentation, Singh spoke about Guru Tegh Bahadur's idea of a just society depicted in his couplet on fearlessness. Paka hunko det neh pe manat an, kohona nik sun re mana, gyani tahe bakhan. And Singh recalls that during And I quote, during the presentation, Dr. Arthur Blue, a psychologist and an active leader of Native professional organizations in Canada and the US, raised his hand and admired the most significant scriptural passage of fearlessness by Guru Tegh Bahadur, saying, frighten none and fear none, is a wonderful statement. Then he vented his cry for social justice. This is what we want. We do not want to be exploited by anyone. We are the masters of this land, but we are treated like slaves. The audience was stunned. At this moment, Peshawar Singh suddenly realized the power of Guru Tegh Bahadur's revolutionary message that infused the spirit of resistance among the representative of Native people in Canada in modern times. Guru Tegh Bahadur was a champion of social justice, and his legacy empowered Sikhs to continue to fight for human rights and freedom of conscience. The story of Guru Tegh Bahadur attaining Shahidi to defend another community and his teaching of fearlessness even touched the First Nations. While Voltaire challenged his opponent when saying, I may disapprove of what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it, he didn't die defending someone else. From the pivotal moment in 1675, when Guru Tegh Bahadur fought the Mughal government's injustices on behalf of the Pandits, Guru Tegh Bahadur became a protector of the oppressed and of human rights. Unlike Voltaire, he sacrificed his life in pursuit of a just society. In the early 20th century, his legacy continued when early Sikh immigrants fought the US government's injustices on behalf of all South Asian immigrants. Last summer, Sikh Americans marched against injustices alongside Black Americans. While some credit Guru Nanak's teachings of equality or the causeless fight against injustice, I would say it was Guru Tegh Bahadur's Shahidi which really solidified Sikhs' commitment to stand against injustice and oppression and to fight for human rights and freedom of conscience. He backed his teachings of fearlessness and the teachings of past Sikh gurus with action. Now we are continuing to see the byproduct of his sacrifice. His legacy continues through Sikhs across the globe. Thank you.
And thank you, Tejpaul. Gorgeous presentation, really, really excellent. I'll present Gurbeer Singh next, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Just a reminder to everyone that go ahead and use the Q&A box, if you please, to post your questions for the presenters. So now we'll turn to Gurbeer Singh, who is a fourth-year PhD student in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California here at Riverside. His research interests include Sikh schisms, Sanatanism, the origin of lineages, post-colonial Punjab, and authority in the Sikh tradition. And today, Gurbeer will be presenting on colonial and post-colonial inspirations, the life and work of Guru Tegh Bahadur in Sikh society. I'm very much looking forward to it. I'll turn it over to you, Gurbeer. You have the virtual podium.
Thank you for that introduction, Adam. Yeah, I'm very humbled and very excited to be presenting to you all today. So let's see if I can get my screen shared. All right, does everyone see my presentation?
Yes, sir.
Perfect. Second. All righty, so my paper is The Colonial and Post-Colonial Inspirations, the Life and Work of Guru Tegh Bahadur in Sikh Society. So Guru Tegh Bahadur, we've heard a lot about him today, so I'll keep the introductions brief. And his execution and his martyrdom described very briefly in Guru Gobind Singh's Bihtar Natak, Tilak Janju Rakha Prabhataka Kino Badu Kalu Mein Saka. He protected the forehead mark in sacred thread, which marked a great event in the Iron Age. Sadhan Hed Iti Janakari Sees Diya Par Si Na Uchari. For saints, he laid down his head without even a sigh. Taramahed Saka Janakiya Sees Diya Par Sirar Na Diya. For the sake of Dharma, he sacrificed himself. He laid down his head, but not his creed. Natak Chetaka Kiye Kokaja Prabhalogan Kehe Avat Laja. The saints of the Lord abhor the performance of miracles and malpractices. So Guru Gobind Singh speaks to the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur. Though the exact details of the acts that led to his execution are not completely clear, they show the proofs that the Guru laid his head down for the Hindus. Guru Tegh Bahadur's martyrdom laid down the foundation for the ideals of Sikh sacrifice for others that Sikhs still hold dear today. I will specifically speak to the experiences of the inspirations of Guru Tegh Bahadur during and after the British Raj in Punjab. So the colonial period. I'll be starting off with the Rakabganj movement. The Rakabganj movement happened in light of the British tearing down a wall of the then very small Gurdwara Rakabganj in order to quote unquote beautify the area for the new House of Parliament. And for those of you that you know, the House is Parliament is literally right in front of Gurdwara Rakabganj. This news quickly spread to Punjab, where Sikhs started protests in Delhi and held conferences in protest of the act of the wall being torn down. The result of these protests were the wall being rebuilt with public funds by the British themselves. The Rakabganj movement itself drew from Guru Tegh Bahadur's life and execution. Those Sikhs used his life as an inspiration to be willing to go as far as giving their lives on the same land that their Guru had given their life. The British Act was compared with the likes of Aurangzeb's tyranny. So, you know, it was a juxtaposition of the British Raj and Aurangzeb and the Mughal Empire of the time. This agitation was successful in restoring the wall and led to further Sikh agitations against the British in the future. So imperial calls to take arms. The British recruited Sikhs by referring to their history as glorious warriors and the sacrifices of the Gurus against tyranny. Proof of this are in archives of Sikh recruitment books that can be today found on Google Books. The British would reference many of the Guru's sacrifices while trying to recruit Sikhs, including the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur. Since Guru Tegh Bahadur has given his life to protect India from Muslim tyranny, Sikhs must give their lives to protect the crown and the world from the tyranny of the Axis and the enemies of the crown. Guru Tegh Bahadur's execution had been used by the British to get Sikhs to swear their lives in allegiance to the British crown. Guru Tegh Bahadur's Bani about detachment helped solidify the idea that Sikhs should not be attached to life and must sacrifice themselves for the quote-unquote greater good. The crown also used Guru Tegh Bahadur's execution to help solidify the divide between Sikhs and Muslims in Punjab by referencing Guru Tegh Bahadur's rebellion as being against Islam, and that the Guru was killed by Muslims in the name of Islam, helping solidify Muslims as the natural enemy of the Sikhs in the Sikh psyche. This is not to argue that Muslim enmity did not exist before the colonial period, as texts such as Prem Samarag show that these kinds of sentiments did exist before. However, I'm arguing that this concept was solidified into the minds of the everyday man that identified as a Sikh due to the actions of the British and them using Sikh history and Sikh thought in order to get across their ideologies and their motives. Next slide. So the Singh Sabha and the Akali movement in reference to Guru Tegh Bahadur. Guru Tegh Bahadur's execution takes an interesting turn in the Singh Sabha movement. The Sanatani Singh Sabha and Hindu groups used Guru Tegh Bahadur being Hind ki Chadar to argue that Guru Tegh Bahadur was a Hindu. He gave his life for the Janeau, so he must have been a Hindu, meaning Sikhs are Hindus. The Shabda from Bajitra Natak I showed earlier was used as justification for the Guru, thus Sikhs being a part of the Hindu fold. The Shabda specifically being Tilak Janjura Ka Prabhataka. So that one line and the execution of the Guru was used as an argument during the Singh Sabha movement and during that time period to argue that the Sikh tradition is a part of the larger Sanatan Dharma and the Hindu fold. The Lahore Singh Sabha attacked back, arguing that the Guru is a protector of all religions and was fighting for the religious freedoms of Hindus, not for the path of Hinduism itself. As we all know, in the end, it was the Lahore Singh Sabha ideology that reigns supreme in the current and future Sikh psyche. The Akalis used the story of the Guru to inspire Sikhs to rebel against the British, encouraging Sikhs to speak up against the Mughal-like British, even at the danger of their own lives. It was the same Delhi Takht that was oppressing the Sikhs then, as was during the reign of Aurangzeb in the face of Guru Tegh Bahadur. The experiences of contemporary Sikhs were juxtaposed with the experiences of the Gurus and their contemporary Sikhs to encourage and inspire activism against the British Raj. The Guru was being used to inspire Sikhs to work both for and against the British by different parties in the interesting period that was then colonial Punjab. Moving on to post-colonial inspirations and the use of Guru Tegh Bahadur's story and execution in modern India and in the West. So Guru Tegh Bahadur in India. Guru Tegh Bahadur is well known in Delhi, even having neighborhoods named after him. The average Delhiite has learned of his sacrifice due to not only the large influx of Punjabi Sikh refugees of West Punjab, but due to the modern structure of the Indian state. The Indian state exists in a pseudo shadow of secular democracy, where in reality it is a Hindu state in practice, even when under the so-called secular government of the Congress. The Indian state attempts to repress its minorities in order to fit the structures of the high caste elite. Guru Tegh Bahadur is used as an icon of Indian nationalism and patriotism as the Guru laid down his life for the Indians. The idea of Hind ki Chadar is exponentially increased in India to win the loyalty of the Sikhs to the Indian Sarkar. Guru Tegh Bahadur's Hind ki Chadar, so Sikhs must devote themselves to protect Hind from her foreign enemies. So this idea of Hind ki Chadar or Hind di Chadar originates from this idea of Indian nationalism and this whole concept of Indianism and the Indian national. Guru Tegh Bahadur's Hind ki Chadar, due to his execution by Muslims, so subliminally making the Muslim the common enemy of both Sikhs and Hindus. In fact, the original saying is not Hind ki Chadar, but is Srisht ki Chadar, as it was found in Senapati Sri Guru Sobha Granth. So the term Hind ki Chadar is a deviation from the term Srisht ki Chadar, which is how Guru Tegh Bahadur was referred to Srisht being the Chadar of the world, not just Hind. The idea of Hind ki Chadar became prominent in the face of Indian nationalism to proliferate the preeminence of Mata Bharat amongst the Sikh population. However, on the other hand, in Punjab, you still find some elements tracing back to the Akali movement of the tyrannical Delhi throne and its relation to Guru Tegh Bahadur. Delhi's current throne throws down the Sikhs in the Punjabi during the Punjabi Suba movement in June and November of 1984, and in its access to resources and religious equality, as of the previous thrones of Delhi. Only now it is in the disguise of democracy. The Kisan Morcha especially derives inspiration from Guru Tegh Bahadur's time and sacrifice in Delhi. The Sikh farmers are able to put themselves in the shoes of Guru Tegh Bahadur and his time in Delhi to keep fighting for what they believe is right on those same streets of Delhi. Though there are aspects and pushes for hardcore secularism in the Kisan Morcha from some of the Comrade Communist Union leaders, the protesters on the ground stick to their religious inspirations. So Modi and Guru Tegh Bahadur. So these are some tweets that Narendra Modi had given earlier in this year for Guru Tegh Bahadur's 400th Prakash Parv, and the day after his initial tweet, he did go to Gurdwara Sisganj, and this is all actively while the farmers' protests are happening. So Modi, especially during the farmers' protests, paid special attention to Guru Tegh Bahadur, speaking about the ideals and sacrifices in his tweet of Guru Tegh Bahadur. He cites the strength Guru Tegh Bahadur gives to the Indian army, again reinforcing the idea that Guru Tegh Bahadur was Hind ki Chadar, therefore the Sikhs must give the same devotion and the same Qurbani sacrifice to the Indian state, to Hind, to Bharat. Given the context of the situation in India at the time, it was subliminally an ode to Guru Tegh Bahadur being Hind ki Chatar, demanding loyalty from the farmers protesting on the streets of Delhi. The government of Delhi attempts to use sacrifices of Guru Tegh Bahadur to win the loyalty of the Sikhs, who are at the most forefront of the farmers' protests. It is interesting to see the constant contrast of Guru Tegh Bahadur's story being used for both loyalty and resistance on both ends of the spectrum across modern Sikh history. Moving on to Guru Tegh Bahadur in the diaspora. So Guru Tegh Bahadur is used as an inspiration in the West to help youth and Western-born Sikhs to connect to their roots. The likes of Basics of Sikhi make content and videos helping younger audiences relate to the Guru and his sacrifices. Youth groups in the UK, US, and Canada hold programs for youth in English, connecting them to Guru Tegh Bahadur's sacrifice and relating those sacrifices to the struggles of diasporan Sikhs. Those taking part in activism, both Sikh and non-Sikh causes, for example, Black Lives Matter, draw upon the Guru's sacrifice in the face of repressive regimes to stay steadfast in their causes, and even inspiring non-Sikhs to continue their struggle. Sorry, my computer's acting up a bit. So Guru Tegh Bahadur in social media. So Sikhs, especially in the diaspora, take to social media to discover Sikhi and Sikh history. Many Sikhs have taken to social media and created pages on social media to rediscover and reinterpret hegemonies of modern Sikhi so they can learn Sikhi in new ways. The Mahalla Nama project that Dr. Jasjit Singh also mentioned earlier is an example of that. It attempts to dissipate the Sobha Singh picture hegemony and create new art of Guru Tegh Bahadur. However, this ends up begging the question, what essentially is authentic? What is authenticity? Especially on social media, some youth take anything and everything that was pre-Gurdwara reform as authentic and show that across the social media platform, getting lots of views, likes, shares, and follows. And that questions the current hegemony, but at the ignorance of understanding the roles that the Mahants, Sanatananism, and pre-colonial, very late pre-colonial Sikhi and Sikh practice played. And ignoring the idea that pre-reform is not necessarily authentic in the ways that they are seeking authenticity. So in conclusion, Guru Tegh Bahadur's sacrifices and Bani are used to inspire people of two different extremes, a loyalty to the government, and on the other hand, activism and standing up against the government. And these are two different forces fighting against each other, but using the exact same source of inspiration. Again, non-Sikhs using Guru Tegh Bahadur to influence Sikhs, just as we saw as evidence Narendra Modi's tweets. Guru Tegh Bahadur's legacy inspires Sikhs to be active and inspires Sikhs to be detached from their own lives in order to put activism and justice in the forefront. Guru Tegh Bahadur inspires Sikhs to speak for the right of others. This happens in the West, this happens in India. We saw it during the CAA protests. We saw it during the conflicts of Kashmir. We saw it in the West during the Black Lives Matter movement. Because of this ideology created by Guru Tegh Bahadur and sacrifice of others, Sikhs have taken inspiration from that and continue to operate in similar ways. And it's impacted the Sikh psyche in the modern globalized world. Not only are Sikhs acting in South Asia, they're acting across the world for and with different faith groups, different ethnicities, different races, in order to continue to fight for the justice of others. And then something to reflect upon is, how does the life of Guru Tegh Bahadur reflect in our very own lives? I'll end with a couple of tuks of Guru Gobind Singh and sharing a couple of the art pieces from the Mahalla Nama project. So this piece on the left is by Jitendra Singh Darhaili. This is a picture of Guru Tegh Bahadur and the young Gobind Rai when the Kashmiri Pandits had come to ask Guru Tegh Bahadur for his assistance. So dohra theek kar for dalis ser prab kiya pyan Tegh Bahadur seek raya kari na kinhu aan Tegh Bahadur ke chalat peo jagat ko sok hai sab jag peo jai 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 sulok. Breaking the potsherd of his body head to the king of Delhi, he left for the abode of the Lord. None could perform such a feat as that of Guru Tegh Bahadur. Whoops. The whole world bemoaned the departure of Tegh Bahadur. With the world lamented, the gods hailed his arrival in the heavens. And this, the tuk from Chandi Diwar was said in Ardas every single day. Tegh Bahadur simre ka naunid ave tae, sab thai hoye sahai. Then I do remember Guru Tegh Bahadur, through whose gates the 9 treasures come running into my house. May they be helpful to me everywhere. And this art piece is by Simran Kaur, a UK resident, also a part of the Mahalla Noma project. You can see Guru Tegh Bahadur meeting Guru Gobind Rai for the first time when he finally reached Anandapur. So thank you all for listening. And again, it's been a great experience being able to speak to you and share my thoughts. Adam?
Thank you very much, Gurbeer. Excellent. Two presentations I can definitely see in conversation with one another. I've got a bunch of questions for both of you in comments, but I thought I'd maybe turn it over to you two first, because I think both your presentations are in conversation. I'm a little curious to know if either of you two have questions for one another, or ideas, thoughts, common themes. Not to put you on the spot, we can also do Q&A first, and then circle around to that. So whatever you want to do.
Tejpaul, do you want to give it a start?
Yeah, no, thank you. And one for presentation, Gurbeer. I think it is interesting that when we do look at the Indian government's ability to kind of this divide and conquer method, right, and something similar that the U.S. government also did earlier on. And so I think it's very interesting, but like my question would mainly be, and it's not necessarily a question, just something that I'm trying to think over is, in South Asia, when we're looking at it, because over here we're seeing a lot of moments of solidarity amongst marginalized communities. And in South Asia, we see glimpses of it, but it's not, I'd say it's not as widespread as we're seeing in the West when we're talking about solidarity. And I think this is a conversation that we've also had on several different panels when we're talking about the farmers' protests or talking about several different movements. But my thing is, do you see Guru Tegh Bahadur's legacy as something that once we do figure out a way to utilize it and make it a message that everyone can kind of read, something that was mentioned in the panel with Harjeet and Nikki saying, once it's more accessible, the message of Guru Tegh Bahadur's message is more accessible. Do you see it being something that can be utilized by South Asian communities and South Asian activists in South Asia to stand up against this Hindutva wave?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does happen in South Asia, but in different ways. Obviously, the same kind of diversity isn't there. There is diversity in caste, religion, even ethnicity, but not in the same visual forms. However, yeah, we do have these issues in South Asia where, the lines are kind of blurred in the sense that we haven't had that much activism in caste. However, I was reading an article yesterday that there's approved from Jallianwala Bagh into all the way to Akal Takht on the 20th. It's a Dalit Sikh March, so it's what was the title of the program? Rang Rete Guru Ke Bete. And slowly but surely, even in the diaspora, we're starting to see even more activism towards the most subaltern, the most marginalized communities. Again, and this march is in honor of Guru Tegh Bahadur that's taking place. So yeah, I think those are the ideas I wanted to share in regards to that.
Excellent. Let's jump into the Q&A. And of course, if you two have questions and any more for each other, feel free. Let's see here. Dr. Hundal has quite a bit. Hi, Tejpaul. I enjoyed your presentation and overview of Sikh American communities and engagement with activism and social justice in the tradition of Guru Tegh Bahadur's legacy. You seem to be developing a historical and anthropological approach, and I would love to hear you talk more about possible methodologies you can use to develop that project. So for example, we know from existing work, there's a lot of complexity in terms of politics, identities, subjectivities within the community, even as they seek to present a united vision of themselves in relation to racial and religious discrimination in the US. Have you thought about engaging in ethnographic research on Sikh orgs and activism to flesh out the complexities of political mobilization in the US? So what about, an anthropological approach, ethnography?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hundal, for that. And yeah, I mean, I am currently like conducting oral history interviews and kind of looking at research on Sikh orgs and activism in the US. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of complexities looking at just politics, identities, and subjectivities. And I think that's one thing, something that even was mentioned during Dr. Jeet Singh's presentation when talking about Sikh Twitter, right? And it can become very hostile. And that is one thing that I'll say is one thing that I've learned from my experience is that despite everyone, and whether it's at the individual level or at the organizational level, everyone's looking for the betterment of the community and for all. It is something that's interesting because there are moments where I feel like I have to tread carefully. So it is something that I'm trying to kind of answer and question on how I go forward about this. But I do know that there's another grad student, because I'm focusing more on the early Sikh immigrants in America right now, and then later on I will focus, to the contemporary period. But I do know there's another grad student at University of Michigan, Jasleen Singh, who is focusing more on political mobilization within the U.S. So I have been in contact with her, and we kind of have been talking a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I'd also love to be in contact with you and talk more about this and kind of see how we can kind of weave through these issues that I'm seeing. So yeah, thank you for that question, though. It is something that I'm currently trying to answer myself as well.
Excellent. Continuing with Dr. Grewal, for Gurbeer, do you have more references for when the shift between Srist and Hind happened? Dates when this was occurring, people involved in the shift. Very interesting thread. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Harjeet. I still haven't done the in-deep finding other primary sources research on this. I don't think anybody else yet has done academic research on this. I actually came across this because a UK-based Khalistan group had shared this, and then me being curious, I did look into it, and it did end up being true that it was in Sanpati's writings, it was Shrishti Chadar. And the exact when I do look for Hind Ki Chadar, the earliest reference I do see are post-colonial. But the exact dates involved, I'm not too aware. As for people, I think, as most things, it probably was at some point a word of mouth. Somebody said it in a speech, and it just slowly grew and grew, a snowball effect. But again, there's still a lot of primary source research that needs to be done. Looking through the archives, looking through the newspapers, reading speeches. Seeing when we first start seeing reference to this. Yeah, but as for exact dates, people, that's something I'm still working on. But what I have confirmed is that in Sanapati's writing, it is Shrishti Chadar. But yeah, very interesting question where research is very necessary to be done.
And we have another question for you, Gurbeer, from Dr. Brar. And actually, I'm really fascinated by this. He asks, are you aware of a quote attributed to Bulleh Shah, hailing Guru Tegh Bahadur as a Ghazi? If so, how was the Guru seen by non-Sikhs in the 18th century?
I am not aware of that quote, so thank you for bringing it to my attention. As for how were Sikhs seen, how was the Guru seen by non-Sikhs in the 18th century? Again, I feel like it's both ways. You have non-Sikhs who are very, adoring to the Guru. And then the lines of Sikh and non-Sikh end up getting blurred, like, Sindhi Hindus, do we consider them Sikh or do we consider them Hindus? As for, local village Hindus who did adhere and worship to the Gurus while at the same time going to the mandirs and still staying intact with their own self. And at the same time, I'm sure that the, descendants, not the genealogical descendants, but the lineage of the types of Sirhindi who were super anti-Guru Arjan Dev continue to exist and were anti other gurus. And then same later on, again, my research is more in the colonial and post-colonial periods. You have, gosh, what was his name? Yogi Allah Yar Khan, right? He's writing couplets and poetry about the gurus, about Guru Gobind Singh, about the Char Sahibzade. So, I mean, as anything, there were people that were very pro, there were people that were very anti. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people were just in the middle, like they just did not have any kind of preference.
Can I interject here? Bulleh Shah was actually contemporary of Guru Gobind Singh. And he's using the word Ghazi from his Islamic perspective. So maybe, Adam, you can highlight or explain the meaning of Ghazi, spiritual warrior or?
Yeah, that's a very good translation of it. Ghazi is really interesting. The Turkish sphere, you still see the word Ghazi used just to generically mean fighter in a secular sense. But really early on, Ghazi, it comes from a certain raid that the Prophet Muhammad would go on. When he was present on a raid, it would be called Ghazwa. It would take on sort of like this religious connotation. It's not, it's not like a necessarily violent jihad, but it's sort of a religiously sanctioned or approved action, a military action. So yeah, the Ghazi, and then there's so many sultans who take up this title. They're, Ghazi, I think Aurangzeb takes the title Ghazi. It's usually a way of showing that you're a warrior for your faith. So that is really amazing. That would be Bulleh Shah admitting that, he shares the same faith, that Guru Tegh Bahadur is a warrior in his faith as well. That's right. I think that's really fascinating. And there were so many Sufis who, really believed in a universalizing vision of Islam that would include, all of the Muwahhidan-e-Hind, the Unitarians or the monotheists of India. So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating.
Even Babur, after winning the Battle of Panipat, he writes in his Baburnama that now I have become a Ghazi. So Ghazi was the highest title for any Muslim to achieve, So for Bulleh Shah to declare Guru Tegh Bahadur as a Ghazi is a big tribute, I think.
Yeah, I think purposely crossing boundaries there, yes. With all these sultans saying this is what makes them, the highest, the highest Muslim warrior.
Right.
To attribute that to someone who doesn't fit under the umbrella of Islam as strictly imagined by folks like Aurangzeb, or Sirhindi, or the sort of puritanical strain. That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah. Do we have another question from Dr. Graywall for Tejpaul? And he'd like to ask you the same question that he had for T-Share Singh. Do you think there is a noticeable difference in response to pandemic by South Asian Sikhs and diasporic Sikhs, especially people born outside of the Punjab?
Yeah, good question. I would say that I don't see a noticeable difference in response because, income inequality and access to healthcare, several things highlighted the differences between individuals' caste, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity during the pandemic, as several communities, were more susceptible to being affected by the virus than others. And then looking beyond what makes us different, whether this is looking at South Asia or Sikhs in the diaspora, Sikhs stepped into lead roles where governments essentially failed. They took the initiative to help as many people as possible that were affected by the drastic changes, that the pandemic brought to society. Whether, if we're looking at the lockdown in India, we hear the stories of how Bangla Sahib, one of the largest gurdwaras in New Delhi, his kitchen was a vital part of the city's strategy to feed the poor during that pandemic. I believe there was a article by the LA Times that mentioned how they were feeding, serving up to like 40,000 meals per day. And then it increased to almost like 100,000 meals. And then we know about we also heard about the oxygen hunger, right? That was happening in Punjab, in Delhi as well, and across South Asia. And then there was also small stories of, remote parts and remote highways in India as well, gurdwaras in Maharashtra, where, there was a Sikh who fed roughly like 2 million people within like a 10 weeks span. And then even if we look at the diaspora, those who were, born outside of Punjab, even myself included, as soon as the pandemic hit, when I shifted from Riverside back home to Stockton, there was already efforts in Stockton, and, local Sangat was there. And, whether it's looking to, provide groceries and essentials to those who could not travel to grocery stores because they were immunocompromised. We, within Stockton and the county, we delivered groceries and essentials to over 1,000 families within several months. And then once the vaccine came out, then there were Sikhs who were also, and actually before the vaccine too, there were Sikhs who were, whether it was serving meals, whether it's fundraising, whether it's, auntians also just, getting involved. And this is one thing that hasn't been talked about as much when we talk about the pandemic, but there's a lot of auntians locally who kind of got together and just started, making masks, just sat there and started, with the sewing machines and making a bunch of masks, making tens of thousands of masks. And then, when we look at the vaccine, we also have to take into consideration that, there was a gurdwara in San Joaquin County that vaccinated over 40,000 people. One gurdwara vaccinated for over 40,000 people free of charge. Essentially free of charge, meaning that they brought the vaccination clinics to the gurdwara, and it was on site at the gurdwara. Of course, vaccines were free for everybody, but they hosted it at the gurdwara. So I think, whether it was South Asian Sikhs or Sikhs in the diaspora, at the end of the day, I think there wasn't a noticeable difference because, Sikhs have done what they always do, and that's step up when need be.
Gurbeer, you should also read Ratan Singh Pangu's Prachin Panth Prakash. So he has given a very powerful statement. Jab te sees diya gur Dilli, tab te kati Padshahi Dilli, tab te Turk kala pai tilli. So he is directly attributing the loss of Mughal throne to Guru Tegh Bahadur's martyrdom. That their power, slowly and slowly started waning, and ultimately they were gone. So, and he does not use as a Hind ki chadar at all.
Yeah.
So up to Ratan Singh Pangu, you do not have that reference.
Of course.
So this reference comes from 19th century, maybe from people started talking orally, Guru Tegh Bahadur, Hindi chadar, and so on.
Yeah.
but the hint also comes from Tilak Janju Prab Rakha Prab Thanka. So Guru Gobind Singh's Vichitra Natak is also behind this kind of understanding. And you must have seen nowadays, a few months earlier, I was looking at a group of large Hindus not in Punjab or Delhi or Haryana, but other states, they were trying to raise the voice that we should introduce Guru Tegh Bahadur's story in the curriculum of students.
Yeah.
And they were also making the case that the road, Aurangzeb road, should be changed to Guru Tegh Bahadur.
Yeah, I think I had that in my presentation there.
Right.
But so, I think the origins of that isn't necessarily pro-Sikh. Yeah. I think the origins of that is pro-India, pro-Hind, including Guru Tegh Bahadur in curriculums, including Guru Tegh Bahadur in everything that's in non-Sikh states, places.
Yeah.
The origins are that, look, there's this person who is quote unquote non-Sikh, and he took care of the Hindus. He took care of Hind, he took care of Bharat.
Yeah.
I see it as a pro-India move rather than a pro-Sikh or pro-Guru or Sikh philosophy move, that these things are being introduced.
Yeah, but this is always the case. There will be multiple understandings of the same historical event, So every community will use to its own. I don't think Sikhs should mind it, that this is not pro-Sikh or anything. It's okay, if they are acknowledging the sacrifice of Guru Tegh Bahadur, that's very good.
Yeah, I believe the issue comes down to when, any Sikh activism is drowned by that idea. Like I've heard it or I've seen it on like Indian news media where it's like, oh, well, why are these Sikhs standing up against the government? The Guru was Hindu ki chadar, right? That's where this becomes problematic. Obviously, anybody can use the Guru for their own philosophy, but that same philosophy ends up being used against Sikh activism and, Sikh acts that these people are speaking up against the same Hindu that their Guru died for. I think that's where it gets a little shaky on the grounds of whether or not it's moral.
And even adding to that, I think, that is something that even beyond just Guru Tegh Bahadur, I feel like we see something within, when there's a Sikh revolution or a significant Sikh figure who is doing something, several times it is where the dominant community tries to control the narrative and bring those individuals into the dominant fold, whereas that was the exact opposite of what they meant to do. There's even, and I don't want to get too into this, but there was a conversation that I had with actually Amrit Deol when she's focusing on the Gadar Leher, and even when we're talking about the Gadar Leher, where folks try to say that no, it was for to free South Asia rule. These Sikhs didn't care about Sikhi, they didn't care about they didn't care about the plight of Sikhs. It was mainly to free South Asia, so it's making the Gadar a secular movement. Whereas there was a presentation that Amrit Deol had gave, who was focusing. I'm not sure. I think she's finished her dissertation now. Dr. Hundo would know. But she argued that no, the fight of the Gadar was actually one to, for equality and to a fight against anti-colonialism, and it was something that is synonymous with Sikh philosophy. And just because it was to free everyone, pro India and pro India and Hindustan folks have now been using that as like, no, you can't argue that the Gadar is a Sikh movement, it is a Indian movement. Even then we see, and it was a beautiful argument that Amit Deol had given it was at the AAR in San Diego, I believe. So I think that's very similar, where the dominant class kind of utilizes and then weaponizes Sikh movements against Sikhs. Thanks, Dr. Hunda, for letting us know. So Amrit has defended, and she is now teaching at Fresno State. So glad to hear that.
Congrats. It's amazing how if you have a universal narrative, or you have an idea, a conception of humanity or even God as being universally available to all, the way that everyone jumps to co-opt that, with some sort of communitarian or communal identity. It's so easy then if someone has a universal message, to sort of grab it and claim it for your own group. It's remarkable to see, like, you see the same thing with Kabir and Guru Nanak, with like Hindus and Muslims, immediately saying he's ours because they see something that that's meaningful in his message. I wanted to mention, Tejpaul, one thing I really enjoyed is you mentioned Voltaire, and like in the process of mentioning Voltaire, and his willingness to fight for your right, for free speech, right? He's kind of like one of these founding fathers of free speech in the Enlightenment movement, and yet as soon as you mention Voltaire, it becomes obvious, because we're talking about Guru Tegh Bahadur, that before Voltaire was even born, Guru Tegh Bahadur had actually walked the walk, right, and fought and died, sacrificed his life as a korban, as a sacrifice for the rights of others to freely practice their religion. So I kind of really enjoyed that. You sort of by mentioning Voltaire, you show that, hey, actually maybe the ideals we associate with the Enlightenment, with the et cetera, all the stuff that Western Europe is supposed to have some claim on, kind of decentralize that. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's crucial, and it's something that even Harjit Gola just now commented on. I'm gonna just read this comment. He says, "Fine line between appropriation and mutual sharing of ideas, equity and power relationships important to bring into consideration." But yeah, speaking to Voltaire, like that's one thing that I was considering, and at first I'd always joke about it that before these folks in the West kind of started coming up with these ideas, the gurus had already walked the walk and talked the talk. And, because they weren't as made as popular, but Voltaire just said something, whereas the guru, walked the walk, right? So, and this is something that Dr. Pashor Singh also beautifully summarizes at the end of his paper too, where he talks about it's, because of Guru Tegh Bahadur's sacrifice, something that Voltaire never did. Guru Tegh Bahadur's sacrifice is something that, has global significance, and should be talked about more. And, even when we're talking about recent movements in the West, when we're talking about this fight for equality, the feminist movement as well, when we look at the Guru's teachings, right? This was happening centuries ago. The Gurus were doing this centuries ago. And so I think it's relevant information and relevant teachings that can easily be applicable to this day, and kind of understanding that sometimes great ideas don't necessarily come from the West, and they weren't initially thought about in the West.
Absolutely. It reminds me of our last conference. There was a young scholar out of University of Michigan. He's a PhD student. I'm forgetting his name, but we had a little correspondence about the idea of having a secular sphere that is entirely you don't have to even bring the West into conversation about it. We can look at in a way a sort of Persianate sphere where you have Persian Sufi philosophers and thinkers and poets, and then also you have someone like Nandlal, who's able to enter into that conversation, and there's not even really concern about is it Khoda, is it Allah, it's kind of a sort of secular realm of ideas and philosophies that doesn't really demand of you a sort of confessional commitment or identity, other than just being part of humanity, like Sadi's famous verse about how all humanity are members of the same body, there's the same in creation. If one member is hurt, then the rest must feel pain. A horrible paraphrase of it, but this idea that secular humanist ideas that we might otherwise associate with the West and Western Europe are here and present centuries earlier.
Yeah, and I think that's something that even now with this whole this wave of diversity, inclusion, equity that we're seeing, I think, and I just went through a training, so it was earlier this week. So it made me think about this. Just because the West says it louder, we feel like, okay, now we need to cite these Western thinkers and these Western philosophers, even though someone in the East or these someone even maybe within the Sikh tradition or marginalized groups and marginalized thinkers have done this before. So, and that is something that I try to do within my work, is like shifting away from, you know, these Western thinkers, because there's also someone who has done this, probably has done this before, but wasn't just as loud as these Western thinkers were. And then I also want to just notice, I know we were just having this discussion, so I don't want to ignore Dr. Rupinder Brad also sent a quick question. Isn't Guru Tegh Bahadur as an icon of a citizen versus an oppressive state more authentic representation of the Guru's mission? Yes, I'd say 100%. You know, that's exactly what it was. It's a citizen versus an oppressive state, which is something that I try to highlight. And that is his legacy, his social justice legacy, which is what we saw, you know, whether it's what T-shirt Singh was mentioning about what's the citizen warrior, or even if we're looking at the post-1984 movements in Punjab, but even if you want to look in the diaspora and looking at when Sikhs first immigrated to the West and were facing a oppressive state, or in post 9/11 America, and or looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. So yeah, I'd say 100% that is a more authentic representation of the Guru's mission.
Gurbeer, you know, the Britishers used the story of Guru Tegh Bahadur for the relevance of their own regime, you know.
Yeah.
They created a story that when Guru Tegh Bahadur was in the prison, you know, he was looking towards the east.
Oh, that the saviors will come. Yeah.
Towards
The
the west.
saviors will come from the east,
Yeah.
from the west. Yeah, the saviors will come from the west.
Right, yeah. So you can also include all that, you know.
Yeah.
McAuliffe, you know, he also cites Guru Tegh Bahadur's martyrdom and so on. So their mission was to strengthen the British regime.
Yeah.
So they used in their own way. That was very good, you know, in your presentation. And now Indian government tries to use it to its own advantage. So it will continue. So you cannot stop it.
No, of
But
course.
to be aware that there are multiple ways of knowing, you know, the same event and same. So should we now break?
Think so. Can always use extra time if we need it. Some bonus minutes if we need them down the road.
You still have 2 or 3 minutes, Gurbeer and Tejpaul.
No, I think our panel accidentally complemented each other. I think the panels would just be a grad student talk, but I think, you know, Tejpaul covered the now, exactly what's happening now in regards to, you know, Guru Tegh Bahadur inspiring, you know, Sikhs in the West, and then I kind of, you know, talked about what happened in the modern past. So I think this panel ended up being very relatable to each other rather than just random grad student presentations.
Very good. But don't quote me too much.
Yeah, and that was one thing, because it was interesting to me, because like as even T-shirt Singh was giving his presentation, I was like, okay, I should take this out. So I actually took a huge chunk of my presentation out, and then I actually was, because initially Dr. Singh, you were supposed to go first, so I was hoping you'd mention it. So then I just wanted to briefly touch on it, but because I ended up going before you, I ended up having to give a little bit more of what your context was as well.
Yeah. Very good. There's another question, I think, from Nirvikar Singh.
Nirvikar asks, it might be helpful to compare, or suggest rather, it might be helpful to compare Guru Tegh Bahadur's co-optation by Hindutva in the Indian state with what happens with MLK Jr. in the USA. That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, that would be a really good, you know, compare and contrast to do.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. Thank you for that, Professor Nirvikar.
Yeah, it's totally something we'll look into.
Yeah, that's actually, yeah, I'm just like thinking right now about your comment that there's a lot of, I'd say a lot of similarities there. And I think then there's also a lot to consider about what the true narrative is, because, you know, even as we know, sometimes Guru Tegh Bahadurji's narrative of his Shahidi sometimes there's bits and details left out or changed. And same thing with MLK's history, right? Sometimes individuals are leaving out bits and details just to satisfy their own needs. So that is definitely something that I'll consider now. Thanks for that.
Sometimes the role of the state, especially thinking of the evidence that came out only later on about FBI involvement with Dr.
Yeah, I mean, and from both sides, right? We see it was the very state that there were this oppressive regime that they were kind of protesting, both of them, and then this same oppressive regime kind of co-opting their narratives to please these marginalized communities. It's interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, I just love the way that both of you are able in your presentations to make a martyrdom from several centuries ago. You can capture how it means something in the lives of people today, and of course that's something that the rest of the presentations, almost every single one, has accomplished that as well. So I'm really enjoying that theme emerging. It's pretty powerful and meaningful. But Guru Tegh Bahadur's life was powerful and meaningful, so it's appropriate. Absolutely.